A liberal professor openly mocked Donald Trump right in front of Barron, expecting the young man to sit there in silence, but she was in for a brutal surprise. Dr. Linda Markham had spent years turning her lectures into political rants, using her position to attack those she disagreed with. But did she ever imagine Barron would step in and leave the entire room stunned? Tune in, because his response was so unexpected it caused the university to evacuate all the students and shut down for a week. The professor who chose the wrong student. The lecture hall was full, but one student sat apart from the rest, calm and collected. His black suit made him stand out, but his presence alone carried enough weight. Everyone knew who he was, but few truly understood him. Barron Trump wasn't here to debate or draw attention. He was here for one thing: to learn. But while his focus was set on the lesson, his professor had different plans. What started as a math class was about to turn into something much bigger, and Dr. Markham was about to find out the hard way that not every student just sits and listens. She wasn't lecturing anymore. She was sending a message. Her words had an edge, a purpose, and it had nothing to do with calculus. A few students shifted in their seats, sensing that the lesson had taken a turn. And then from the back of the room, a single hand went up. The moment had arrived. Markham hesitated. She wasn't expecting pushback, especially not from him. Ignoring his raised hand, she kept talking, pressing her point. Success wasn't about effort, it was about privilege. Her gaze landed on a few students, making her message crystal clear. The tension thickened, but Barron didn't move. His hand stayed up steady, waiting. The silence stretched. Markham finally sighed, clearly irritated. "Mr. Trump, do you have something to add?" she asked, voice dripping with condescension. She thought she had him right where she wanted, but that assumption would cost her. He spoke, not with anger, not with frustration, but with pure logic. He didn't engage with her game. Instead, he turned the focus back to what they were actually supposed to be learning. He laid out the importance of calculus, how it shapes industries, builds infrastructure, advances medicine. It was pure fact, undeniable, impossible to twist. And just like that, students who had been sitting in uncomfortable silence started to pay attention. Markham's expression hardened. She was losing control of the room. Desperate, she went for another strike, pushing the same tired argument. He could only think this way because of his privilege, that he had never struggled academically, that he didn't understand, but he didn't react the way she expected. He acknowledged it. Yes, he had advantages, and that was exactly why education should push people higher, not lower standards to make things easier. Her face darkened. This wasn't going according to plan. The energy in the room shifted. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore, it was something more. Markham, now visibly frustrated, tried again. She pushed harder, waiting for him to stumble. "What makes you think you can challenge a professor?" she snapped, her voice sharp. She leaned in, expecting to see hesitation, uncertainty, but Barron didn't blink. He didn't shift. He simply met her stare, unwavering, controlled, like he had been preparing for this exact moment. "I'm not an expert," he said, his voice clear. "I'm just a student who actually wants to learn math." And then, without another word, he pointed toward the board behind her. The class turned to look. It was blank. There were no numbers, no symbols, no equations, just a blank board where knowledge should have been. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, unshakable. It filled every inch of the room, pressing down on everyone like a weight. Students sat frozen in place, eyes flicking between the board and their teacher. Something had just happened, and whatever it was, it had changed the air in the room. This wasn't just another lesson. This wasn't just another day. The usual rhythm of the class had been broken, replaced by something else, something no one had expected. Markham, always so confident, always so sure of her control, stood still. She had walked in with a plan, a direction, certain that the discussion would follow the path she set. But that wasn't what happened. Not this time, not today. The moment stretched, seconds dragging longer than they should, then movement. Students glanced at each other, their expressions shifting from confusion to realization. A quiet murmur rippled through the room, soft but undeniable. Some sat straighter, some leaned forward, a few nodded to themselves. Markham had thought she was leading the lesson, but now the lesson had taken a different path. One she hadn't expected, one she hadn't chosen. And at the center of it all stood Barron. He had not raised his voice. He had not shouted or argued. He had not tried to take control. He had done something much smaller, much simpler. He had pointed to the space where knowledge should have been, and by doing that, he had made something clear, something too big to ignore. But Markham wasn't about to lose. Not in front of the class, not to him. She had built her career on authority, and she wasn't about to let one student, especially this student, make her look weak. Her face remained calm, but her eyes were cold now. If he wanted a challenge, she would give him one. If he thought he was so smart, she would make sure he regretted it. Without a word, she turned, picked up a marker, and scrawled a complicated equation onto the board, convinced this would be the moment he finally slipped. The impossible equation challenge. The classroom felt like a battlefield, everyone waiting for the first strike. Dr. Markham's glare was sharp as she took slow, deliberate steps toward the whiteboard, marker in hand. "All right, Mr. Trump," she said, voice dripping with challenge. "Since you have such strong opinions about mathematics, let's put that confidence to the test." The marker screeched against the board as she wrote, numbers and symbols piling up in a monstrous equation that stretched across the surface. A few students exchanged nervous glances, some even whispering. This wasn't just difficult, this was the kind of problem that sent even seasoned mathematicians into a cold sweat. She turned, smirking as she tapped the marker against the board. "Go ahead," she said, arms crossed. "Show us how it's done. Unless, of course, you'd rather sit down and keep talking about things you don't understand." The words stung, and the challenge was clear: humiliation or victory. The class held its breath, waiting for the inevitable embarrassment. But Barron didn't flinch. He stood up, calm as ever, and walked toward the board. His expression was unreadable, his movements steady. Dr. Markham's smirk widened. This was going to be good. She had deliberately chosen this problem, knowing full well that it required methods far beyond anything taught in the course. There was no way he could pull this off. Then Barron spoke, his voice even and controlled. "Before I begin, I'd like to point out that this problem has more than one approach. Would you prefer I use the standard method or a more efficient solution based on original work by Leibniz?" The room fell silent. Even she hesitated for a moment. "You've read Leibniz's original work?" she asked, the confidence in her voice faltering slightly. "Yes, in the original German. The translations lose some of the finer details." Barron didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The message was clear. This wasn't a bluff. He knew exactly what he was doing. He turned back to the board and without hesitation began to write. His movements were precise, his steps deliberate. The problem that had looked insurmountable moments ago now seemed to unravel under his pen. It wasn't just that he was solving it, he was explaining every step as he went, making it look almost effortless. The class watched in stunned silence, phones slowly being raised to record what was quickly becoming something more than just a math lesson. This first step, Barron continued, was first introduced by Euler in the 1700s. It simplifies what appears to be a complicated integral into something much more manageable. His hand moved across the board, the solution unfolding like a perfectly orchestrated plan. Even students who had struggled with basic calculus before found themselves following along. Dr. Markham, arms still crossed, leaned slightly forward, her eyes darting between the board and Barron's face. She was trying to find a flaw, some mistake she could call out, but none appeared. Barron wasn't just solving the problem, he was teaching it in a way that made more sense than any lecture she had ever given. "Now," he said, nearing the final steps, "we have two ways to proceed. The traditional method would take up another full board, but there's a more elegant approach using a lesser-known principle from Leibniz's notes." He turned to face her. "Which would you prefer?" Her expression was unreadable, her earlier smugness completely gone. The class, still recording, waited for her response. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence. "Could we see both?" It was Sarah Chin, one of the quieter students, her voice hesitant but firm. "This actually makes more sense than how it was explained in the textbook." Barron smiled, nodding. "Of course." He turned back to the board and continued. She remained silent, watching as the student she had intended to embarrass took complete control of her classroom. The weight of the moment hung in the air. This wasn't just about solving an equation, it was about proving a point. By the time Barron finished, the entire board was filled, but his work was as clear and clean as a textbook example. He set the marker down and turned back to the class. "And that," he said simply, "is how it's done." The silence stretched for a long moment. Then slowly, a few students began to clap. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew. The energy in the room shifted. Phones were still raised, capturing every moment. The classroom debate had already changed everything, but when Dean Richardson walked in, things took an even bigger turn. A professor's authority put to the test. The classroom door burst open with a loud bang, and in stormed Dean Richardson, a close supporter of her political stances. He barely took a breath before announcing, "Linda, we need you for an emergency faculty meeting. It's about the curriculum changes." The timing was absolutely terrible, or perhaps perfect depending on how one looked at it. She turned to her students, attempting to wrap up the session. "We'll continue this demonstration another time," she said, trying to maintain authority, but before she could take a step, Barron spoke up. "Professor, you gave me a public challenge. You asked me to solve this in front of everyone," Barron said, his voice steady but firm. His words sent a wave of murmurs through the class, and even the dean hesitated. Leaving now wouldn't set the right example about academic integrity, would it? Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. Dean Richardson's expression darkened, his mouth tightening as if preparing for a scolding. "Young man, are you implying—" "I'm not implying anything, sir," Barron cut in, polite but unwavering. "I'm simply stating that Dr. Markham wanted to make a point about privilege and merit, and I accepted the challenge. The only question is, will she follow through?" The weight of the moment was undeniable. Some students had their phones out, capturing what was clearly turning into something bigger than a classroom debate. She glanced at the marker in her hand, then at the equation on the board, the same problem she had picked to supposedly expose a lack of ability. But now it was her own competence under the microscope. The dean, who had arrived as an authority figure, now found himself just another spectator. The tension grew unbearable. Barron, in a move that left everyone breathless, held the marker out to Dr. Markham. "Or perhaps," he said, a quiet challenge in his tone, "you'd prefer to solve it first. After all, you've made it clear that knowledge is what really matters. As our professor, surely you can walk us through the solution?" The classroom fell into a stunned silence. Her fingers tightened around the marker as if it had suddenly turned to lead. Her mind raced. How had this happened? How had the moment she designed to humiliate one student flipped into an interrogation of her own knowledge? The presence of the dean wasn't a shield anymore. It was a witness, a judge. Phones stayed lifted, capturing every moment. She started, then faltered. Her eyes darted to the board. The equation wasn't impossible, but under this kind of scrutiny, every second felt like a lifetime. Barron, unshaken, extended an olive branch. "We could solve it together. Collaboration often leads to better understanding." There was no mockery in his tone, no arrogance, just a genuine offer. But that made it even worse. Dr. Markham's pride wouldn't allow her to take it. Her jaw clenched. "This is absurd," she snapped, tossing the marker onto the desk. "This entire stunt is nothing but a privileged student trying to undermine my authority." The class collectively exhaled, but the moment of tension didn't dissolve. It shifted. Now it was Barron's turn to pick up the pieces, or rather the marker. He bent down, retrieved it, and met Dr. Markham's fiery gaze with cool determination. "No," he said, voice unwavering, "this is about moving forward." And then, without another word, he turned to the board and did something that would leave the room breathless. In less than 5 minutes, he completed both solutions, the traditional method and an alternative approach. His movements were quick, precise, and completely unshaken. As he wrote the final number, the class exploded into applause. Even the dean couldn't hide his astonishment. But this wasn't the moment that would change everything. That came next. Dr. Markham stood there, her face drained of color, her carefully built reputation starting to crumble. Barron wasn't finished, though. He stepped back, facing both his professor and the dean. "Mathematics doesn't care about politics, backgrounds, or biases," he stated, gesturing at the board. "It only cares about truth. And when we let personal agendas cloud our judgment, we miss the opportunity to grow." The dean cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Trump, while your mathematical abilities are impressive, you must understand that..." Before he could finish, a voice rang from the back of the room. "That what?" It was Michael Chin, a quiet scholarship student who rarely spoke. "That we should learn less math because of someone's political beliefs?" The words cut through the air like a blade. And just like that, the classroom, the faculty, and the institution itself were forced to face a new reality. One where knowledge, not authority, would decide who held the real power. What started as a classroom argument didn't stay in the room for long. Soon, more people heard about it, and the whole school was watching. One lesson that redefined the classroom. Dr. Markham's class was supposed to be about calculus, but instead it had turned into something else entirely. Students were getting frustrated. One stood up and said they came here to learn math, not to get a lecture about privilege. Others nodded, their patience running out. The air in the room was thick with tension, and for a moment it seemed like Dr. Markham was losing control of the class. Then a student did something unexpected. He spoke up, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise. He acknowledged that Dr. Markham knew a lot about math, but maybe they should stick to that instead of these other discussions. He even offered to help other students outside of class, blending theory with real problem solving. It was a lifeline, a way for Dr. Markham to keep control without backing down completely. The room fell silent, waiting to see what she would do. Dr. Markham hesitated. Her whole approach had been about challenging privilege and making students think about more than just numbers. But now, faced with the reality of their frustration, she had to make a choice. Slowly, she admitted she had been wrong. She had spent too much time focusing on one issue and had ignored what she was actually there to teach. The shift was subtle, but it changed everything. For the first time, she really saw her students for who they were, not just who she assumed they were. Then came the real shock. Students outside the class had started gathering. Word had spread fast. People were watching the drama unfold in real time, posting videos and reactions online. Soon, a crowd formed outside, holding signs with phrases like "teach math, not politics" and "merit over bias." The situation was about to explode into something much bigger than just a classroom debate. But the student who had spoken up wasn't done yet. Instead of letting things spiral, he walked to the door and spoke to the crowd. If they were here to learn, they should come inside. And just like that, students poured in, filling every seat and standing along the walls. Dr. Markham watched, stunned. She had been struggling to keep students engaged, and now, thanks to him, the room was packed with eager learners. What happened next became legend. He took the marker and turned the class back to what it was supposed to be: math. For the next hour, students listened, asked questions, and actually learned something useful. It wasn't about privilege or politics anymore. It was about numbers, equations, and real-world applications. And for the first time in a long time, Dr. Markham felt like she was truly teaching. The story spread across campus like wildfire. People expected it to be about a professor getting humiliated, but instead it became something else. Enrollment in advanced calculus skyrocketed. Dr. Markham, humbled by the experience, changed her approach. She went back to focusing on what she loved, teaching math. The student who had spoken up, true to his word, led study sessions and helped others bridge the gap between theory and practice. Was this professor trying to teach math, or was she using her position to push an agenda? And did she ever expect Barron Trump to outshine her so easily? Tell us what you think, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.